She had one job: enter Blackwell Manor, find the Duke, end him before he reached Parliament. Nadia Hawthorne had prepared for this, weeks memorizing his routines, studying his weaknesses, rehearsing the moment she would slip poison into his wine and walk away, clean, cold, no hesitation. The silver locket at her throat held everything she needed. Her uncle told her Augustus Blackwell was a monster, the man who destroyed her father, broke her mother, and would condemn her brother to death if he spoke before Parliament. This was justice. This was survival. But tonight, standing in his firelit chamber, with poisoned wine glowing dark in the crystal glass, something went wrong. Augustus Blackwell woke. Not with fear, not with anger. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for his entire life, and he said something that made her bloodhour run cold. "I know why you are here, Nadia." Her name, spoken quietly, like he had been expecting her all along. Her hand trembled. The glass should have reached his lips. The mission should have been complete. But what happened next changed everything, because Augustus Blackwell was not what she expected. The mission was not what it seemed, and the choice Nadia had to make would either save her family or destroy the only person who had ever seen her for who she truly was. 7 days at Blackwell Manor, one impossible decision, and a truth so devastating that by the time she discovered it, it was almost too late. Stay with me, because nothing about this story is what it seems. The rain came down like a judgment that night. It fell across the iron rooftops of London in long, slanting sheets, gathering in the gutters, drowning the light from the gas lamps, until even the strongest flame looked small and uncertain. The cobblestones shone like dark mirrors beneath the wheels of passing carriages, and the fog rolled in from the river so thick that the streets seemed to disappear entirely beyond 50 yards. Most people had retreated indoors by then. Sensible people. People without missions pressed against their hearts like a blade. But a black carriage rolled steadily westward through the storm, its brass lanterns cutting pale circles in the fog, its wheels carving deep ruts through the mud. The horses moved with the heavy certainty of animals that knew where they were going, even if the passengers inside had not yet decided whether they truly wished to arrive. Inside the carriage, Nadia Hawthorne sat very still. She was dressed in ivory silk, the kind of gown that said wealth without screaming it, a language aristocratic women learned before they learned how to read. Her dark hair was swept up beneath a pearl-threaded comb, and her gloved hands rested folded in her lap, with the careful arrangement of someone who had rehearsed stillness until it looked like calm. She was not calm. Her spine was rigid against the leather seat. Her breath came in shallow pulls, and beneath the lace at her throat, on a delicate chain that disappeared into the modest neckline of her gown, hung a silver locket. It looked like sentiment, a keepsake, a woman's small, private tenderness pressed close to the skin, but inside it was poison. Across from her sat Ambrose Hawthorne. Her uncle was a thin man, the kind of thin that came not from illness, but from something deeper, from years of narrowing himself to fit through doorways that should have been closed to him, of making himself small enough not to be noticed until the moment he wished to be. His coat was impeccable, his cravat precisely knotted, and his pale eyes moved between Nadia's face and the dark window with the economy of a man who had been calculating risks since before she was born. He had been speaking for some time, not loudly. Ambrose never spoke loudly. He spoke the way a knife moved, quietly, precisely, and always towards something vital. "You understand what happens," he said, "if Augustus Blackwell reaches Parliament." Nadia looked at the fog beyond the window. She had heard this before. She would hear it again. Sebastian is condemned. Sebastian is destroyed. Ambrose, let that word settle like ash. There is a difference, Nadia. Condemned implies a trial with some faint hope of mercy. What Blackwell carries in those documents is not evidence for a trial. It is a public execution dressed in legal language. Your brother's name, our name, will be spoken in every drawing room in England as a synonym for traitor. Your father died working to protect this family. Your mother spent her final years watching society turn its back on us because of what Blackwell and his allies chose to put into the public record. All of that. Every wound, every humiliation, every door slammed in our faces, it ends with you. Nadia's gloved fingers tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. She thought of her father. Not the memory her uncle preferred, the noble patriarch betrayed, but the real memory, the private one. The way he had looked the last time she saw him, smaller than she remembered. The particular slump of a man who has had his dignity quietly removed from under him, and cannot find where it has gone. She thought of her mother, who had stopped going to church, not because she had stopped believing in God, but because the looks from the congregation had become too much to carry through an entire service. She thought of Sebastian, her brother, brilliant and reckless in equal measure, who had made choices Nadia did not entirely understand and was now paying for them in a cold room somewhere there with a false name above the door. I understand, she said. Ambrose studied her for a moment. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, though his eyes remained watchful. The invitation was no accident. Augustus Blackwell knows the Hawthorne name. The fact that he has chosen to extend this courtesy to our family, to you specifically, tells me he has taken a private interest. Whatever his reason, it is your way in. This was what Ambrose had told her, that the Duke had requested her, that the other guests were only there for propriety, to make a week of country house entertaining look respectable rather than deliberate, that beneath the polished surface of Blackwell's social calendar was a specific desire. Nadia Hawthorne. She believed him. She had no reason not to. Once you have his attention, Ambrose continued, the rest follows naturally. A man who wants something becomes careless about protecting himself from it. You will gain access, and when you do, I know what I must do. The words came out flat and final. Ambrose seemed to prefer it that way. He sat back and turned his face toward the window, and they rode the rest of the distance in silence. The carriage slowed, and then Blackwell Manor rose through the fog. Nadia had imagined it smaller, less absolute. The reality was something else entirely. It rose from the surrounding countryside like a declaration. 4 stories of grey stone, its facade lit from within, so that every tall window glowed amber and gold against the dark sky. The roof line was dressed with stone gargoyles that watched the approaching road with expressions of bored menace. And iron gates stood open at the bottom of the gravel drive, flanked by footmen in dark livery, who stood motionless beneath black umbrellas, as though rain were simply something that happened to other people. The carriage passed through those gates. Nadia's hand rose to the locket at her throat. Her fingers curled around it briefly, not to open it, only to remind herself it was there. A small, cold weight against her pulse. The Duke must die before the week is over. She pressed the thought down into the bottom of herself, beneath the layers of silk and rehearsed composure, and stepped out of the carriage into the rain. The entrance hall of Blackwell Manor was everything the exterior promised and more. Marble floors, so polished, they reflected the chandelier above like a second sky. Walls panelled in dark oak, hung with portraits of Blackwell ancestors who all shared the same quality of gaze, watchful, unimpressed, certain of their right to judge. Servants moved at the edges of the room with the practiced invisibility of people who had been trained to be useful without being noticed. The other guests had already gathered in the receiving room beyond the hall, and the low hum of aristocratic conversation floated through the open doors. Nadia could hear the particular pitch of it, the careful brightness that people adopted when they were watching each other very closely and did not want it to show. She removed her wet cloak, handed it to a waiting maid, and straightened her shoulders. Then she heard the room go quiet, not the total silence of shock. The gentler, more deliberate silence of a crowd that had decided collectively to pay attention. It moved through the gathering like a slow wave, swallowing one conversation and then the next, until even the women with painted fans had stilled their wrists. Nadia looked toward the staircase. Augustus Blackwell stood at the top of it. She had been given descriptions of him. Her uncle had mentioned his reputation. The ruthless Duke of Ravenshire. Feared in Parliament and in society alike, a man whose political enemies had an unfortunate tendency to simply stop being relevant. She had constructed a picture from those descriptions. Older, perhaps, or at least bearing the look of a man who had spent too long accumulating power and too little time remembering he was human, heavy-handed, arrogant in the blunt way of men who had never needed to be subtle. The man at the top of the stairs was none of those things. He was tall, the kind of tall that did not need to announce itself, dark-haired, with the sort of face that had been built for severity. A strong jaw, a mouth set in a line that gave nothing away, brows that could have been carved from the same stone as his manner, his black evening coat fit with the precision of armor, and he descended the stairs with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone. His age, she thought. 30, perhaps a year or two past it. Not the ancient monument she had imagined. Nadia hated him the moment she saw him. She hated him because her uncle had taught her to, because her family's ruin wore his title, because somewhere in this manor were documents that could end Sebastian's life as he knew it. And this man had written them with a calm hand and no apparent regret. She held that hatred close and firm. Then Augustus Blackwell's eyes found hers. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, no more. Across the full width of the receiving room, through the soft light of 100 candles and the accumulated gaze of 30 aristocratic guests, his attention landed on her with a precision that felt entirely unlike accident. His expression did not change. He did not smile or nod or do any of the things a host does when acknowledging a guest. He simply looked at her, and the look was sharp and knowing and strangely intimate, as though he had already thought about her before she arrived, and whatever he found in front of him now was confirming something he had suspected. Nadia's fingers moved before she could stop them. They rose to the locket. She caught herself and stilled her hand, but it was a small, involuntary gesture, the kind a person makes without deciding to, and she saw, or believed she saw, something shift in Augustus's gaze in the moment before he looked away. A steward appeared at Nadia's elbow and guided her forward. She moved with him, letting herself be arranged, which was something aristocratic women were very good at, being moved from one place to another, while appearing to have chosen their position themselves. The steward led her to stand beside a small cluster of women near the far wall. Nadia looked at them, and her carefully assembled composure cracked, just slightly, somewhere deep in her chest where it did not show on her face. She recognized Lady Annabella Carrington immediately. Everyone in London society recognized Annabella. Golden-haired, impeccably dressed, possessed of the sort of beauty that had been carefully managed since childhood into its most advantageous form. She stood with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once doubted that she belonged in any room she entered. Beside her was Violet Stursling, darker, quieter, with sharp eyes and a father who sat on 3 parliamentary committees. And beyond her, Caroline Prescott, whose family had enough money to prop up a small country. They were not decoration. Nadia understood this with a cold, sinking certainty that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the look on each woman's face. They were not standing here because propriety demanded a full house party. They were standing here because they had each been evaluated as a possibility. They were candidates, Augustus Blackwell was choosing a duchess, a woman to secure his line, to strengthen his position, to give him an heir. Nadia was not the hidden favorite. She was one possible choice among several. The weight of it struck her with a force that surprised her. Not because she wanted to be chosen, she told herself fiercely, but because she had been sent here on the assumption that she already was. Her plan, the quiet, deadly logic of it, had depended on closeness, on access, on a man who wanted her enough to lower his guard. If Augustus had to be persuaded to want her in the first place, the entire mission had to be rebuilt from the ground up. She stood very still and let none of this reach her face. Annabella noticed her almost immediately. Her gaze moved over Nadia's ivory gown and pearls with the practiced efficiency of a woman who sorted other women the way a card player sorted a hand. What was useful, what was not, what could be discarded. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that carried a blade in it. "Miss Hawthorne," she said pleasantly. "How unexpected." I had not realized the Duke's circle had broadened to include a small, elegant pause, all of London's social range. The women nearby waited. Nadia looked at Annabella with the complete composure of someone who had spent years learning how to be insulted gracefully. "Lady Carrington," she replied, her voice warm and entirely unbothered. What a comfort it must be to walk into a room already certain of one's position. Some of us prefer to earn ours. A beat of silence. Then one of the other women turned away to hide a smile. Annabella's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. Nadia filed the exchange away and turned her attention back to the room. She caught Augustus watching her from across the gathering. He had not missed it. She could not read his expression, and that was the most unsettling thing about him. Not his authority, not his reputation, but the quality of his attention. He watched the world with the detached precision of a man who was always a step ahead of the conversation he was currently having. He was looking at her the way a chess player looks at a piece that has just done something unexpected. Then, slowly and deliberately, he turned and offered his arm to Annabella Carrington. The room breathed out. Nadia did not move. She did not allow herself to feel what she was feeling. A strange, hollow sting that she refused to name. She was not jealous. She was angry, but only strategically. Annabella now had access Nadia needed. That was all. That was the only reason. The sight of them walking together felt like a hand pressed flat against her chest. She believed that. She spent the rest of the evening believing it very firmly. When she finally returned to her chambers, a beautiful room on the second floor, all dark silk curtains and candlelight, she stood in the center of it for a long moment still, in her gown, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. She thought about Ambrose, about the way he had presented her with a mission that depended on a set of conditions he had either invented or been wrong about. She was not the Duke's chosen woman. She was a name on a list. She would have to become something more before she could do what she came to do. She opened the silver locket, looked at what was inside for a long moment, closed it again. A knock came at the door. "Come," she said. The door opened. A young maid stood in the corridor, her face carefully neutral. "His Grace requests your presence in his study, Miss Hawthorne." Nadia went very still. Then she reached up and checked that the locket sat properly at her throat. "Tell His Grace," she said, "that I will be down shortly." She walked to the mirror, studied herself for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and followed the maid into the dark corridor, toward the low glow of firelight at the end of the hall, toward the study where the ruthless Duke of Ravenshire was waiting for her. She told herself she was walking toward an opportunity. She almost believed it. The study was lit by firelight and a single lamp on the desk. Rain streaked the tall windows in uneven lines, and the wind moved in the chimney with a low, irregular sound like breath. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves. Law books, political histories, estate records. Parliamentary proceedings bound in dark leather and standing in rows so precise they looked like soldiers at attention. On the desk, sealed documents sat in two careful stacks. A crystal decanter of dark wine stood on the side table, two glasses beside it, one already half poured. Augustus was standing near the window when Nadia entered. He had removed his evening coat. His waistcoat was dark, his sleeves precise, but the cufflinks undone at the left wrist. A small detail that somehow made him more rather than less intimidating, because it suggested he had not dressed for this meeting. It had not been arranged for show. He did not turn immediately when she entered. He waited a moment, not rudely, but with the quality of a man who was accustomed to finishing one thought before beginning the next, and who believed other people could manage the brief interval of being unacknowledged. Then he turned. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. "Quieter, thank you for coming." "I was invited," she said. Something crossed his face. So brief, she almost missed it. The very beginning of something that might have been amusement stopped before it arrived. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing toward the chair nearest the fire. He moved to the side table as she settled herself and poured the second glass without asking whether she wanted it. He set it on the small table beside her and took the opposite chair, his own glass in hand, and studied her with the unhurried attention of a man who had all the time in the world. Nadia looked at the wine. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been told to be aware of. Not long, not obviously, but with a particular quality of attention that was different from simply seeing a glass of wine on a table. She looked at it and then made herself look away. "You seemed surprised this evening," Augustus said, "when you were shown to stand with the other women." "Did I?" Her voice was level. "I thought I managed it rather well." "You did," he agreed, "but I was watching." A silence settled. The fire crackled. The rain tapped against the glass. "My uncle's understanding of the invitation may have differed from your intent," Nadia said carefully. "Your uncle's understanding of many things differs considerably from the truth." He said it without heat, simply as a fact. "Tell me, what did Ambrose Hawthorne tell you this visit was?" She looked at him steadily. "He told me it was a respectable country gathering, that you had extended the invitation with some particular consideration for our family." "And you believed him?" "He is my uncle." Augustus turned his glass slowly between his fingers, watching the firelight move through the wine. "Ambrose Hawthorne has been telling careful half-truths for a very long time. It is one of the things he does quite well. The other things he does well are considerably less respectable." Nadia kept her expression still. Something tightened in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular feeling of standing on ground that was not as solid as it had appeared. She let none of it show. "That is a serious accusation," she said. "It is an observation," he replied. "Accusations come later with documentation. Of which there is, it happens, quite a lot." Another silence. This one felt different. Heavier, more deliberate, like a door that had been opened and was now waiting for someone to decide whether to walk through it or close it again. Nadia looked at the wine glass on the table beside her. She had not touched it. She thought about the locket at her throat. She thought about what she was sitting here to accomplish. And then Augustus said, with the calm precision of a man stating the weather, "You watch my glass more carefully than you watch my face, Miss Hawthorne." The room went very still. Nadia's heartbeat measured the silence. 1 beat, 2, 3, and then she lifted her gaze to his and held it without flinching. Because flinching would be the end of everything. "I find your face rather more difficult to read than a glass of wine," she said. "The wine, at least, stays where it is." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set his glass down. He stood and moved toward her. Not quickly, not threateningly. but with that same unhurried deliberateness, as though the distance between them was something he was choosing to reduce, because he had decided to, not because he was compelled to. He stopped close enough that Nadia would have needed to lean back to avoid looking up at him. "You study exits," he said quietly. "You have noted the position of every servant. Since you entered this room, you sat with your back to the wall." A pause. "And your hand went to that locket the moment you saw me this evening." He was not angry. That was the strangest part. His voice carried no accusation, only observation, the tone of a man cataloguing facts before he decided what to make of them. Nadia's pulse was loud in her own ears. "Perhaps women who have lived through what my family has lived through develop a habit of watching," she said. "Perhaps." He tilted his head slightly. "Or perhaps you came to Blackwell Manor with a purpose that has nothing to do with a respectable country house party." His hand moved, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back toward the locket at her throat. He stopped with his fingers an inch from the silver chain, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand without being touched. He was giving her a choice. Nadia did not move. She held herself perfectly still and looked at him with the steadiest expression she owned. Inside, something was moving through her that she refused to name. A sharp, bright awareness that had nothing to do with mission or strategy, and everything to do with the particular quality of being, seen by someone who was not fooled. He was not fooled, but he had not stopped her. He lowered his hand and stepped back. "If you intend to survive this house, Miss Hawthorne," he said softly, "you will need to lie considerably better than you have been." It was shaped like a warning, but there was something in the way he said it. Quiet, almost careful, as though the advice were genuine, that made it feel less like a threat and more like an acknowledgement. He was telling her he knew, and he was also, somehow, telling her he had not yet decided what to do about it. Nadia rose from her chair, her skirts settled. She was proud of how steady her hands were. "Thank you for the wine," she said. "I find I'm not thirsty after all." She turned and walked to the door. "Miss Hawthorne." She stopped, her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. "Whatever your uncle told you about the Hawthorne bloodline and what threatens it," he said, "I suggest you consider the possibility that he has not told you everything." She stood there for one breath, two. Then she walked out into the dark corridor, and the door closed behind her with a quiet, definitive sound. Her footsteps carried her back through the manor's hallways, through the warm pools of lamplight, past the rows of watching portraits, along the length of corridor that separated the study from the guest wing. She moved without hurrying. She would not be seen to hurry. But when she reached her chamber and closed the door behind her, and turned to face the dark and quiet of her own room, she pressed her back against the door and let out a long, slow breath she had been holding since the moment he reached for her locket. He knew something was wrong. He did not know everything. If he had known everything, she would not have been walking free in his hallways. But he knew enough to be watching her, and a man who watched her that closely was infinitely more dangerous than any simple adversary. She reached up and unclasped the silver locket, held it in her palm and looked at it. She was supposed to be afraid of him. She was. She was certain she was. Then why, she thought, did the memory of his voice saying her name feel less like fear and more like something she had no word for? She pressed the thought out of her mind. She set the locket on the Drensetable. She would need a different strategy, a better approach, something that could survive his attention rather than crumble beneath it. She would need him to trust her before she could destroy him. The fire burned low while she sat and thought, and outside the rain continued to fall. The second day of the party moved at the measured pace of all aristocratic gatherings, organized leisure that was never truly leisurely, entertainment that was never truly for fun. Breakfast was served in the long dining room at 9, and the conversation at the table was as precisely arranged as the silverware. Nadia observed everything. She had spent the pre-dawn hours thinking, and she had arrived at the only logical conclusion available to her. She could not work from a distance, whatever Ambrose had imagined, that she could maintain the detached position of a woman not quite chosen, moving invisibly near the target, while never quite being noticed, was impossible now. Augustus had already noticed her, more than noticed. He had seen something in her that he was not yet naming, and the danger of that was that men like Augustus Blackwell did not let things they were paying attention to simply slip away. She had to move toward him, not away. She had to make herself interesting enough, specific enough, worth choosing. Not in the way a woman was chosen for a title, but in the way a private man chose to open a door he had been keeping closed. She had to do this without letting him look too closely. It was, she thought, the most complicated thing she had ever been asked to do, and the most dangerous, because the same proximity that gave her access also gave him the opportunity to find the truth. She was at breakfast when he appeared. He entered the dining room with the unhurried authority of a man in his own house, greeted his guests with the calibrated warmth of someone who had managed public occasions for years, and took his place at the head of the table. Nadia was seated midway down the right side, far enough to observe without being observed, which she had chosen deliberately. He noticed anyway. His gaze moved the length of the table in what appeared to be a hospitable survey of his guests, and when it reached her, it paused. Briefly, only briefly, before moving on, Annabella, seated to his left, said something that made him smile. It was not a large smile, more like a controlled concession to the social requirement of appearing agreeable, but Annabella received it like a victory. Nadia cut her toast into precise pieces and told herself she was not watching. The morning was given over to entertainment. A tour of the gardens for those inclined, billiards for the men, and a musicale in the drawing room for the women. Nadia endured the musicale for 40 minutes before excusing herself on the grounds of a slight headache, which was half true, because everything about the gathering had begun to press at the back of her skull. She wondered. The manor was extraordinary when it was not performing. Without the weight of 30 pairs of watching eyes, the corridors were simply beautiful. The wall coverings rich and subdued, the paintings worth study. The light falling through tall windows onto floors that had been polished smooth by generations of careful maintenance. This was a house that had been lived in for a very long time. It had accumulated a kind of density that newer houses did not have. Layers of life and history built up until even the air in the hallways felt different. She had wandered as far as the library before she heard footsteps. Not a servant's footsteps. Servants moved differently. Always at the edge of the room, always with that careful minimizing of sound. These footsteps were unambiguous. Augustus appeared in the doorway. He was not particularly surprised to find her there, or if he was, he managed it perfectly. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "escaping the musicale or searching for something specific?" "The musicale was not holding my attention," she said. "I was looking for something to read." He came into the room without invitation, which was, of course, his prerogative in his own house, and moved to one of the shelves with the ease of a man who had spent a great deal of time in this particular space. He ran a finger along a row of spines and drew out a volume, turned it in his hands. "What kind of reading do you prefer?" he asked. "Something honest," she said. "Fiction lies about everything important. History at least lies about the right things." He looked at her. "That is an unusual way to think about honesty. It is an unusual time to be honest." He held the book out to her. She took it. Their fingers did not touch, but the space where they almost did felt inhabited in a way she chose to ignore. She looked at the cover. A history of land enclosure, acts in the previous century. "You are serious," she said. "I rarely joke about land enclosure." He moved to the chair nearest the window and sat. He did not invite her to stay. He also did not ask her to leave. He simply existed in the space, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for both of them to be in this room together. Nadia stayed. She did not examine why. She took the opposite chair and opened the book and read. And he read something from the desk, and outside the window the wet morning garden glistened and dripped, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was something else, full rather than empty. The silence of two people who were each thinking a great deal and choosing which thoughts to share and which to keep. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said, "Your father worked in Parliament briefly." "He did," she said, "before he was discredited." Discredited is a gentle word over what happened to him. I find that gentle words make certain memories easier to hold. She kept her eyes on the page, and I find that men who discredited him find certain gentle words very convenient. "I did not discredit your father," Augustus said. "You maintained a political position that had the same effect." "My political position was based on the evidence available to me at the time." He paused. "Evidence that I have since had reason to re-examine." This made her look up. He was watching her with that steady, measuring quality she was coming to recognize. Not predatory, not unkind, but utterly committed to seeing clearly. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," he said carefully, "that the story of the Hawthorne family may be more complicated than the version that has been in public circulation, and that some of the people most loudly proclaiming that version may have had strong personal reasons for doing so." Nadia's breath caught very slightly. She let nothing else betray her. "You are being deliberately vague," she said. "I am being appropriately cautious," he replied. "There is a difference. I have learned not to present conclusions before I have gathered all the evidence. And there is at least one person in this house whose interest in preventing that evidence from being gathered runs very deep indeed." He meant Ambrose. She was certain he meant Ambrose. The whole careful architecture of her mission seemed to shift on its foundations. Just slightly. Just enough to make her feel that she was standing on something that was not the solid ground she had thought it was. She looked back at her book. Her mind was moving very fast in several directions at once. The morning stretched into afternoon, and the afternoon into evening, and Nadia moved through both, with the growing, uncomfortable sense that the portrait of Augustus Blackwell she had been given was perhaps not the only one in existence. She saw him in the drawing-room before dinner, explaining a point of estate management to an elderly baron with a patience that clearly cost him nothing. The patience of a man who believed the information mattered, not the social credit of giving it. She saw him on the terrace before dark, speaking quietly to the head gardener, and from the gardener's expression she gathered that whatever was being discussed involved something the man was genuinely worried about, and that Augustus was genuinely listening. She watched him decline to embarrass an awkward young viscount who had said something foolish at the table. He simply redirected the conversation, smoothly, without drawing attention to the redirection. And the Viscount went away not knowing how close he had come to public humiliation. She watched all of this and then spent a long time telling herself that none of it changed anything. He still held documents that could end Sebastian. He was still the man who had, by action or omission, by alliance or by silence, contributed to the dismantling of her family's name. She was still here to do a specific thing. These facts remained. But facts, she was discovering, had a frustrating tendency to coexist with other facts. The world did not sort itself into the clean shapes that missions required. On the third day, he chose her for the morning walk through the conservatory. The other women watched as she took his arm. She felt their watching like heat on her back, as they stepped through the glass doors into the green, rain-scented quiet of the conservatory, where orchids bloomed in impossible colors, and the glass ceiling amplified the sound of water until being inside felt like being inside weather. "You have been thinking very hard," he said. They walked between rows of specimens, and his pace was easy, unhurried. "I can see it. You have the look of someone who has discovered that two things they believed were contradictory might both be true." "That is an uncomfortable discovery," she said. "The most important ones usually are." They walked in silence for a moment. A drop of water fell from the glass above and landed on the stone path between them. "Why am I here?" she asked. She meant it plainly, without strategy. She wanted to see what he would do with a direct question. He considered it. She respected that he considered it, that he did not reach immediately for an easy answer. "Because," he said slowly, "I believe you may be the most honest person in this house, despite considerable efforts to be otherwise. And in a week that requires a great deal of navigation, that particular quality is rarer and more valuable than beauty, fortune, or political connections." Nadia stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She turned to look at him and found him looking back with an expression that was impossible to categorize. Open, in a way she had not seen him be open with anyone else, but watchful still. As though, even in this moment of apparent honesty, he had not stopped evaluating. "You said that," she said carefully, "to a woman whose family you helped ruin." "Yes," he said, "I did." The honesty of it disarmed her more than any smoothness would have. She turned back to the orchids and began walking again, because she needed the motion to think. "The air question," she said after a moment. She had told herself she would not raise it. She raised it anyway. "You made your requirements clear when you announced the purpose of this week. A duchess must be able to secure the Blackwell line. That is the reality of the title," he said, "and all the women here understand that." "Yes, then you are choosing based on capability as much as preference." He was quiet for a moment. "I am choosing based on something I have not entirely named yet," he said. "I am trying to be honest about that, because anything else would be unfair." She thought about the physician's words, years ago. She thought about the way her former fiancé had looked at her when the rumors about her health reached him. Not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular expression of someone recalculating a transaction they had entered in good faith, and finding the numbers had changed. She thought about what it would mean to want something you were not sure you could give. "That is more honesty than most people manage," she said. "I have found," he replied quietly, "that being feared makes honesty easier. People rarely argue with a man who has already frightened them into silence." She heard something in it. Not self-pity. He was not the kind of man who indulged self-pity, but something that rhymed with loneliness, pressed flat, and matter-of-fact. They completed the circuit of the conservatory. He returned her to the main house with perfect courtesy, and she went back to the other women with the feeling of someone who has stepped into a river, expecting shallows, and found the ground unexpectedly giving way. That evening at dinner he danced with her. He had danced with Annabella first. Her obvious displeasure at being only first, rather than only, was visible in the tight pleasantness of her smile. He danced with Violet Sterling and said something that made her laugh. He danced with Caroline Prescott with the formal competence of a man executing an obligation. Then he crossed the room and held out his hand to Nadia. She took it. They danced in near silence, which was unusual in a setting that usually required the obligatory exchange of pleasant observations about the music and the room. Neither of them offered those observations. They moved through the figures of the dance with the strange ease of two people who had already had a more serious conversation than the one a ballroom usually permitted, and the ease was more unnerving to Nadia than awkwardness would have been. His hand at the small of her back was appropriate, nothing more. But she was aware of it in a way she was not aware of most things. She was also aware, as the dance ended, that she had not once thought about the locket. This realization came to her in a cold wave the moment after the music stopped and they separated. She had not thought about it. For the entire duration of that dance, the mission, the poison, the silver locket at her throat, none of it had existed. She stood alone at the edge of the floor while Augustus moved on to the next social obligation, and she felt something cold and clarifying move through her. She was in trouble, not the kind of trouble she had arrived expecting. The other kind. The fourth day of the party was quieter than the rest. Rain had settled over Blackwell Manor with the patience of something that intended to stay. Clouds pressed low over the grounds, and the light that came through the tall windows was the silvery, diffused kind that made everything look slightly more beautiful than it was. Softened, as though the world had decided to be kind for an afternoon. Nadia sat in the library. She was not reading. The book in her lap was simply a prop, open to a page she had not looked at, while her mind worked through things that were no longer entirely organized. She had been in this house 4 days now. She had been private with Augustus twice, once in his study, once in the conservatory, and each time she had left knowing more than she wished to. He was not what she had been told. He was not precisely what she had decided to make of him in the absence of adequate information. He was something considerably more complicated, and complication was, she was discovering, far more dangerous to a mission than simple evil. It was easy to despise a monster. It was something else entirely to despise a man who had, in the space of 4 days, given her a book on land enclosure acts, told her she was honest, and looked at her across a library as though she were the most interesting thing in the room. She hated how much that last part mattered to her. She thought about the physician who had seen her after the fever. 3 years ago now, she had been 22, and the illness had been severe and long, and when she recovered, the doctor had spoken to her uncle in terms that he relayed to her with a gravity that suggested he was delivering news that changed her value. She might never safely carry a child to term. There had been complications during the fever. Damage of the sort that could not be fully understood without time, and the time had not been kind. Her body, the doctor had suggested, was uncertain ground for the thing it was primarily required to produce. Ambrose had told her not to speak of it. Her former fiancé, a pleasant young man who had meant no cruelty, had simply and quietly withdrawn his suit when the rumor reached him. He had not been unkind about it. He had simply been practical, which was worse. She had packed the knowledge away, learned to carry it without letting it alter her posture, learned to sit in rooms full of society women, discussing their children and their hopes and their futures without allowing the particular weight of it to show in her face. But in this house, in this week, where a man was selecting a woman specifically for the future she could provide him, the weight had come back with an unmerciful clarity. She wanted to be chosen. She had not expected to want that. She had expected to perform the wanting and find the performance easy. But there was something about the way Augustus looked at her, not like a possible candidate, not like a name on a list, but like a person worth attending to, that had peeled back the performance and found something real beneath it. And what was beneath it was afraid. The door opened. Augustus entered the library without announcement, which was his habit in his own house. He carried papers under one arm, and he stopped when he saw her, something shifting in his expression. "I did not know you were here," he said. "I can take these elsewhere." "Stay," she said before thinking about it. He stayed. He settled at the desk with his papers and worked in silence for a while. She maintained the fiction of reading. The fire crackled between them. Then he said, without looking up, "You have gone quiet today. I am often quiet. Not like this. Today it sounds like something specific." She considered and rejected several answers. "Tell me about the heir," she said. The words came out more plainly than she intended. She had not planned to raise it again, but the afternoon had made her honest in a way she could not entirely control. He set his pen down. He looked at her across the room with the careful attentiveness she had come to know as his version of concern. "The heir," he repeated slowly, "is a requirement of the title, not a personal obsession. There are families waiting for the Blackwell line to weaken. An estate this size without a clear succession becomes a target." He paused. "It is not the most important thing I am looking for, and yet it is required." "Yes." "Even if the woman you chose could not?" She stopped. Something changed in his face. He rose from the desk and crossed the room and sat in the chair across from hers, close but not crowding, the same careful management of distance she had noticed in his study, always close enough to make the conversation intimate, always leaving space for her to breathe. "Could not what?" he asked. She looked at her hands, at the book in her lap, which she had not read a word of. "There was an illness," she said, "several years ago. The physician indicated that." She stopped again, and then made herself continue that my ability to carry a child safely was uncertain, possibly compromised. She said it the way you say something you have practiced saying without feeling. It is not widely known, but it is the truth. Silence. She did not look at him. She looked at the fire, which was safer. "Is that why your former engagement ended?" he asked. She had not told him about the engagement, but a man who had spent weeks reviewing the Hawthorne family situation would know about an engagement that had been quietly and publicly dissolved. "Yes," she said. More silence. The fire popped. A log shifted. "Nadia," she looked up at the use of her given name. He had not used it before. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees, his expression stripped of the careful neutrality he usually maintained. "A duchess who cannot produce an heir," he said, with a measured deliberateness that told her he was choosing each word very carefully, "is a problem I can navigate with time, with legal counsel, with arrangements that exist precisely for such situations. A duchess who is a performance, who is present in name only while absent in every other way that matters, is a problem I have no solution for." She looked at him. "Before you," he continued, "I approach this week as a logistical exercise, a selection, a woman suitable to the requirements of the title, appropriate to the position, acceptable to Parliament and to society." He paused. "It is not how I am approaching it now." Her breath was not entirely steady. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you told me the truth," he said simply, "and I find I want to be worth receiving it." The fire moved between them. The rain moved down the windows. Outside, the grounds of Blackwell Manor lay under their soft grey sky, and inside, in the library, two people sat with the specific stillness of those who have said more than they intended and are not yet sure what to do about it. Nadia thought about the locket. She thought about Sebastian. She thought about Ambrose's voice in the carriage, listing what the Hawthorne name had lost. She thought about this man who had sat across from her and said the words she had spent 3 years believing she would never hear from anyone who mattered, and she was afraid. Not of him, of herself, of what she was capable of losing if she did not finish what she came to do. They stayed in the library for another hour without speaking, both of them nominally occupied with their respective reading and work, and neither of them occupied with that at all. The afternoon light shifted slowly through grey to amber. The fire burned steadily. When she finally rose to dress for dinner, she paused at the door. "Augustus," she said. It felt strange to say. Foreign and right at the same time, he looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." He held her gaze for a moment. "Always," he said. She went upstairs to dress and sat at her dressing table and looked at the silver locket lying beside the perfume bottle and the hair comb and the other small tools of a woman's appearance. And she, stayed there a very long time. That evening, at dinner, she found herself watching the way he moved through his own house. The particular combination of authority and loneliness she had begun to recognize as the specific shape of his life. He was a man who commanded rooms and emptied them at the same time. People gave him space not out of disrespect, but out of the particular deference that was the hidden cost of power. The way everyone adjusted themselves around him rather than with him, so that he was always slightly separate. Annabella said something pointed at the table, something about old families and recent scandals and the unreliability of invitations extended to those who had not earned them. That was aimed with precision at Nadia. Nadia let it pass. Augustus, without looking up from his plate, said, "Lady Carrington, I believe you were describing a walk you wish to take tomorrow. Perhaps we can return to that." Annabella blinked. Then she returned to the walk. Across the table, something complicated moved through Nadia's chest. She looked at Augustus and found him looking back. And for exactly 1 second, before she broke the gaze, she could not have told anyone what she felt. She could only tell them it was not what she had come here feeling. She reached for her wine-glass. Her hand trembled. Not because she was afraid of him, because she had gone a full day without remembering why she was here. And the moment she remembered, something in her did not want to. The message reached Ambrose on the afternoon of the 4th day. Nadia did not know this. She was in the library with Augustus, speaking in the honest, careful way of 2 people who had crossed some invisible threshold and were still working out where they now stood. She did not know that one of the servants in Blackwood Manor had another employer, or that a brief, folded note had made its way out of the house and down the road to a coaching inn where Ambrose was, waiting, or that Ambrose had read it and folded it neatly and sent for his nephew. She did not know any of this until the 5th night. She returned to her chamber at 10:30, carrying the usual collection of small sensory impressions she seemed to accumulate in this house, the particular warmth of the dining room, the sound of Augustus's voice carrying from the far end of the table the way candlelight moved across the embossed wallpaper in the corridor. She had begun to notice Blackwell Manor differently. At first it had been a stage set, a place she was moving through for a specific purpose, and its beauty had been strategic information, cover and architecture. Now it was beginning to feel like a place, solid, particular, real. This was a problem. She changed out of her dinner gown, with the help of the maid assigned to her, dismissed the girl, and sat down at the dressing table to remove her hairpins. She was reaching for the silver locket, to unclasp it, to set it aside as she did each night, to let herself breathe without it for a few hours when the curtain moved. Not in the way of wind, in the way of someone behind it. Nadia stilled. "Do not make a sound," said the shadow behind the curtain. "It is me." The curtain moved aside, and Sebastian Hawthorne stepped out of the alcove with the careful movements of a man who had spent months learning how to exist in small, hidden spaces. She would not have recognized him at once in a crowd. He was thinner than she remembered. Not the spare thinness of health, but the hollowed quality of someone who had been eating anxiety and uncertainty for months. He wore the grey jacket of a working servant, and his hair was cut shorter than he had ever worn it, and the face she had grown up with was the same shape but different in the eyes. Older, harder, the particular hardening that came not from time but from fear. Her heart moved toward him before she could stop it. Sebastian. She crossed to him and took his face in her hands and looked at him in the way that only sisters look at brothers they thought they might never see again. "What are you doing here? If you are found, I will not be found." He took her hands gently and lowered them. His grip was steady, but there was something beneath the steadiness that was not. "I came because Ambrose sent word that the mission was not progressing, that you had developed complications." Stepped back from him. "Complications," she repeated. His word, not mine. Sebastian moved to the chair near the fire with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to make more noise than necessary, and sat. He looked at her with the same measuring quality she had not realized until this week she shared with her brother. But I have eyes, Nadia. I have been in this house for 2 days. I see the way you move around him. You have been here 2 days. As a footman, it is easier than it sounds when people look through servants rather than at them. A tired ghost of a smile. I have learned a great deal about how to be invisible. She sat across from him, on the edge of the bed, and kept her hands quiet in her lap. He is still meeting with the others, Sebastian said. Not just you. He raised a hand against her expression. I am not saying this to wound you. I am saying this so that you can see it clearly. Annabella Carrington. He spent 40 minutes with her in his study yesterday evening, after the rest of the house had gone to bed. Violet Sterling. He sent for her after breakfast this morning. Caroline Prescott spoke with him privately in the garden this afternoon. I know he is evaluating multiple candidates, Nadia said. I have never been under any illusion about that. Then why are you behaving like someone who has forgotten what you came here to do? Silence. Sebastian's voice did not rise. That was the most difficult thing about it. He was not angry, not cruel. He was afraid. The fear was visible in him, like a candle held too close. This trembling, exhausted fear of a man who had been hiding for months and had come out of hiding because he believed his sister was the only thing standing between him and ruin. He has evidence, Nadia, Sebastian said. Whatever he has told you, whatever conversations you have been having in his library, none of it changes the fact that by the end of this week, he is going to get into a carriage and ride to Parliament, and when he arrives, he will present what he has, and what he has is enough to condemn me. He told me the documents may be more complicated than that, she said carefully, that Ambrose may have been involved in the original scandal, that the story of our family may not be the story that has been told. Something moved in Sebastian's face. He told you that, he said slowly. Yes. A silence that felt very different from the previous ones. Then Sebastian said, and you believed him. I do not know what I believe. Nadia. He leaned forward. His voice was very quiet now and very precise. He is a man who wants something from you. Men who want something will tell you whatever version of the truth is most useful to them in obtaining it. You know this. You have always known this. He looked at her with the particular intimacy of someone who has grown up in the same rooms, who knows the history behind every expression. What did he tell you when he spoke of heirs? She did not answer. Sebastian read her silence. He needs a woman who can give him an heir, Sebastian said. That has not changed. The documents, the politics, the week of conversations. None of it changes what this estate requires of whoever he chooses. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was so quiet it was almost gentle, which made it worse. He does not know about the fever, about what the physician said. She said nothing, but when he finds out, Sebastian stopped. He looked at his hands, looked back at her. Do you truly believe that a man desperate for an heir will choose a woman who may not be able to give him one, when he has Annabella Carrington standing 3 feet away? The words entered her with the precision of something that had been built for exactly this purpose, not to cut, but to find the place that was already bleeding. She sat with them for a long moment. Sebastian was not inventing her fear. He was not constructing it or placing it in her. The fear had been there since the physician's study, since the afternoon her former fiancé had sent a note rather than come in person. Sebastian was only giving it a voice, and a voice, she was discovering, made a fear much harder to argue with. Ambrose did not tell you everything either, she said. Her voice was very even, about what he knows, about what he has done. Ambrose is trying to save this family, Sebastian said. Ambrose is trying to save himself, she replied. Another silence, longer this time. Sebastian looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between grief and resolution. "Perhaps," he said, "but the end result is the same, Nadia. If Augustus reaches Parliament, I am finished. I am not speaking of inconvenience. I am speaking of the end of my life as anything recognizable." His voice for one moment cracked at the edges. "I am your brother. I am the only family you have left who can still look you in the eyes, and I am asking you." The fire moved between them. Nadia looked at him, at the thinness of him, at the fear that lived behind his eyes even when he was managing it most carefully, and felt the oldest and most complicated kind of love, the love that did not require the beloved to deserve it, the love that existed independent of judgment or fairness. She thought about Augustus. She thought about the library and the conservatory and the way he said her name as if it were a word that had weight. She thought about what it would mean to choose between them. Sebastian pressed the silver locket into her hand. She had left it on the dressing table. He must have taken it when she was not watching. She looked down at it. It felt heavier than it had 4 days ago. "Before dawn," he said quietly. "On the last day, that is all you have left." He did not wait for her answer. He moved to the window, checked the corridor below, and was gone in the way that men who have learned to disappear are gone. Quickly, silently, without looking back, Nadia sat alone in her chamber, with the locket in her palm, and the fire burning down around her. She stayed there a very long time. She did not sleep. When the grey of pre-dawn began to soften the darkness beyond the curtain, she rose and, dressed in the dark, and stood before her mirror, and looked at herself for a long time. She was the last of the Hawthorns who could stand in a room without hiding. She was the last one who could do anything at all. She clasped the locket at her throat. She thought about her father's face. She thought about her mother's silence. She thought about Sebastian's cracked voice saying, "I am your brother." And then she pressed the door, closed on every other thought, and walked out of her chamber into the cool pre-dawn dark of Blackwell Manor's corridors. The manor was the quietest it had been all week. Before dawn, Blackwell Manor stopped performing. The chandeliers were dark. The great rooms were empty of guests and music and calculated social effort. The corridors held only the occasional low burn of a night lamp and the sound of the house settling around itself. The creak of old timber, the movement of wind in the chimneys, the particular silence of a place that had been awake for days and had finally gone to rest. Nadia moved through it like a ghost. Her footsteps were soft on the carpet runners. She had left her heeled shoes in her room. She wore only her dressing gown over her dress, and she moved with the careful exactness of someone who has mapped a route and committed it to memory and is now executing it without allowing herself to think about what she is moving toward. She could not think about it. If she thought about it, she would stop. She had thought about it all night, and she had decided, and if she thought about it again, she would lose the decision. So she walked. She counted her steps. She focused on the physical mechanics of moving through the dark, left at the portrait of the 3rd Duke of Ravenshire. Down the long corridor, right at the window alcove where she had once sat with a cup of tea and watched the rain. Up the secondary staircase to the north wing, where the master chambers were. She reached the door. She stood outside it. Everything was quiet. She pressed her fingers to the locket at her throat, and the small silver weight of it was steady and cold. She told herself, Sebastian. She told herself, Bloodline. She told herself, Father. She told herself, this is the last morning, and the only chance, and it will be swift and over before the rest of the house wakes. She turned the handle. The room was warm. Augustus had a fireplace in his chambers, and it had burned down to deep orange coals that gave the room a faint amber glow rather than true light. The effect was of something just slightly out of focus, shapes visible, details softened, the edges of everything imprecise. He was in the chair by the fire, asleep. Not in bed, in the chair, in the way of a man who had been working late, and had simply stopped in the middle of it. Papers lay on the small table beside him and across his knees, and his head had tipped slightly to the side, and his cravat was loose, and his face in the firelight was the face of someone who, for the span of this unguarded hour, had stopped carrying anything at all. He looked nothing like the Duke of Ravenshire. He looked like a man who was tired. Nadia stood inside the doorway and did not move. She had imagined this moment many times. She had given it a clinical quality in her mind, clean, necessary, the swift execution of a thing that had to be done. She had told herself it would be easy to perform once the decision was made. The way all difficult things become strangely simple once you are actually inside them. She had been wrong. Her chest ached in a way she had not anticipated. She looked at him, at the lines of his face softened by exhaustion, at the particular way his hands lay relaxed against the arm of the chair, at the papers he had been reading before sleep took him, estate petitions. She could see the heading on the nearest page from where she stood. Not parliamentary documents, estate petitions. Work he had carried into the night because it mattered to him, because somewhere in those pages were people who depended on him. She looked away. She moved to the side table near the fire where the wine was. She had noted it earlier in the week, his habit of leaving a glass of wine on the side table before he retired. She had seen the glass there twice in passing, and it was there now. Dark wine in a crystal glass, catching the coal's glow, beautiful enough to hide what she intended to put inside it. She opened the silver locket. Her hands were shaking. She had not expected that. She had expected cold resolve, the clean, terrible stillness of purpose. Instead, her hands moved with a fine tremor that she could not still no matter how tightly she held them, or how directly she spoke to herself. She held the locket over the glass. She thought of Sebastian. Do you truly believe a duke desperate for an heir will choose a woman who may not be able to give him one? She thought of her father and of the look of a man who has been made small. She thought of her mother, who had stopped going to church. She poured. The liquid fell into the wine in a thin, almost invisible thread, and the glass received it without ceremony, and then it was done. The wine looked exactly as it had before. There was nothing to see. There was only the glass, and the fire, and the man sleeping in the chair 6 feet away, and herself. She stood there. She should leave. She could not leave. She stood with the empty locket in her palm, and looked at the glass, and then at him. And something in her had begun to come apart at the seams. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, irrevocable way of a structure that has been holding under too much weight for too long, and has finally begun to give. He shifted in the chair. The papers on his knees slid. He reached for them instinctively, half waking, and they fell to the floor, and the sound of it, small, ordinary papers falling on a carpet in a firelit room, brought him the rest of the way awake. He lifted his head. His eyes found her, not with alarm, not with suspicion. They found her the way eyes find the thing they were looking for, even from sleep, which was the most devastating thing about it. Nadia, he said quietly, her name, in his voice at this hour, in this room. It struck her in the place that had no armor. She could not speak. He blinked, gathering himself, and then he sat forward in the chair and reached with one hand, unhurried, automatic, toward the wine-glass on the table beside him. He had not looked at it yet. He was still looking at her. His hand moved toward the glass. She watched it as though the world had slowed, his fingers extended. The glass was 3 inches away. 2, Nadia thought. This is what I came here to do, she thought. Sebastian, father. Bloodline, she thought. He said your name the way someone says a word that matters to them. His fingers touched the stem. She thought of the physician's voice, saying uncertain ground. She thought of her former fiancé's note rather than his face. She thought of Annabella Carrington's smile and Violet Sterling's political allies, and the particular, unfeffable gap that was Nadia Hawthorne and what she did and did not have to offer, she thought. He told you the truth, and then he told you the truth again. And then he looked at you across a library and said always. The glass began to rise. She struck it from his hand. The sound it made when it shattered against the stone border of the fireplace was shockingly loud in the quiet of the room. Crystal against stone, a sharp ringing crack, and then the scatter of pieces across the hearthrug, and the wine spreading in a dark bloom across the grey stone. The glass was gone. The wine was gone. The poison was gone. Augustus stared at the floor, at the broken glass, at the spreading darkness on the hearthrug. Then, very slowly, he turned his face to hers. The firelight moved between them. His expression was not angry. It was not frightened. It was the expression of a man who has been handed a piece of information that rearranges everything he thought he understood about the last 7 days, and who is doing the remarkable, difficult work of rearranging it in real time without looking away from the person who delivered it. Nadia, he said, still quiet, still her name in that particular way. Her eyes burned. She had been holding herself together since Sebastian appeared in her room, since she had pressed the door closed on every thought that was not mission, since she had walked through the dark house, telling herself she was the last Hawthorne who could stand without hiding. The holding together had required every resource she possessed. She did not have anything left. You were sent to kill me, he said. She looked at him. She did not look away. Yes, she said. He looked at the floor, at the broken glass, back at her. And yet you stopped. Her voice cracked at the edges when she spoke, but she made herself say it clearly, made herself give him the truth she had spent this entire week trying to protect herself from. Because I love you more than I fear them. The room held the silence of that confession for a long moment. The fire moved. A coal shifted. The light on the walls trembled and steadied. Augustus sat very still. His hands were on the arms of the chair, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before. Not in the library, not in the conservatory, not in the study where he had told her to lie. Better. His composure, which was formidable, and had been one of the first things she had identified as both his weapon and his armor, was doing something she could only describe as releasing. Not breaking. Releasing. In the way of something that has been held very tightly for a very long time, and has finally, in the specific presence of the right person, been allowed to let go. Tell me, he said. Everything, she told him. It came out not in the organized form of a confession, but in the form that truth often takes when it has been compressed too long, in fragments, non-linear, sometimes doubling back on itself. She told him about Ambrose in the carriage, about the locket, about the mission. She told him that Ambrose had said she was the Duke's hidden interest, and that she had believed him and built a plan on that belief, which had collapsed on the first evening when she saw the other women. She told him about Sebastian, hiding under a false name, hiding in this house for 2 days, hiding behind a curtain in her bedroom and saying, "I am your brother," in the voice of a man who had been afraid for so long that the fear had become the sound of his breathing. She told him about the physician. She told him about the fever and the uncertain ground and the fiancé who had sent a note. She told him that Sebastian had used this knowledge deliberately. Not to wound her, she thought, but because he was desperate, and desperate people reach for whatever is sharpest, and that it had worked. She told him she loved him, and that she had been trying not to since the conservatory. She told him all of it. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not call for his servants or his guards. He sat in the dying firelight and listened to the full, unedited truth of why a woman had stood in his room in the darkest hour of the morning with a shattered crystal glass on his hearthrug and told him she loved him. When she finished, The silence was very different from any silence that had preceded it in that room or in this week. Augustus rose from the chair. He crossed to where she was standing, and he moved differently now than he had in the library or the conservatory, without the careful management of distance, without the considered restraint. He moved the way a person moves toward something they have stopped pretending not to need. He stood before her. "The documents I carry to Parliament," he said quietly, "are not intended to destroy the Hawthorne name. They are intended to expose the men who did, Ambrose Hawthorne among them." He let that settle. "Your father was not the architect of the treason that destroyed him. He was a man who discovered something he should not have, and who was too principled to be bought. The men who needed him silenced arranged for him to appear guilty. Ambrose was among those men." Nadia could not breathe. "Sebastian," he continued, "is guilty of fear and of running, and of doing some foolish things to survive while hiding. He is not guilty of treason. If he testifies truthfully before Parliament, if he exposes Ambrose and the others, the case against him becomes, at most, a lesser charge with a path toward resolution." She stared at him. "You knew," she said. "I suspected. The documents gave me enough to be certain." A pause. "Nadia, I did not invite you here to destroy you. I invited you here because I needed to understand whether you were part of your uncle's plan or another person being used by it. And because—" He stopped, and for the first time in the week she had known him, he looked uncertain. "Because when I saw your name, I thought that perhaps you deserved to know the truth about your father." The fire burned between them. Nadia, who had come to Blackwell Manor as a weapon, and had become a woman, and had almost become something she could not forgive herself for being, and had chosen at the final moment not to be. She stood in the firelit dark and felt something she had no single word for. Grief and relief and shame and gratitude and love, all at once, in the specific, complicated way of things that are real rather than imagined. His hands moved to take hers. She let him. They stood like that in the dying firelight, holding each other's hands in the quiet of a room where a glass had shattered, and the wine had spread, and the worst thing that was going to happen that morning had not happened at all. Dawn came into Blackwell Manor the way it always does, quietly, with no concern for what the night has arranged. The light gathered in the east windows first, pale and tentative, feeling its way into the corridors, and up the stairwells, and across the polished floors of the receiving rooms, touching the portraits on the walls with the same pale indifference they had been touched with every morning for 200 years. The house smelled of cold stone, and last night's fires, and the faint trace of rain, which had finally stopped some time before 3. It was the last morning of the house party. Most of the guests were still asleep. Augustus had not slept. He sat at his study desk in the first grey light, his coat back on, his papers organized and reread and stacked with precision. And he thought about what had to happen next. Not because the path forward was unclear. It was, in fact, considerably clearer than it had been in weeks, but because he wanted to think carefully before he acted. Some decisions deserve the courtesy of careful thought. He had sent 2 servants, one to find Sebastian Hawthorne in the household and bring him quietly to the ground-floor library, the other with a carefully sealed note to the coaching inn on the main road where Ambrose Hawthorne had been staying while his niece executed a mission on his behalf. Nadia was in the library. She had been there since he left her in his chamber. He had given her the choice of where to wait, and she had chosen the library, which he thought said something about her, that when given the freedom to go anywhere, she chose the room where she had been most honestly herself this week. Sebastian arrived first. He came in the livery of a footman, which was clever, Nadia had to admit. He was thin and careful, and very still when he saw her waiting. Then he looked at Augustus, and was stillest of all. "Sit down," Augustus said. He was not unkind about it. He was simply direct. I have found that conversations are better conducted seated. Sebastian sat. He looked between them. Between his sister's face, which told him something serious had happened, and the Duke's face, which told him nothing, except that the Duke was the most composed person in the room. "My sister told you," he said. "Your sister did not tell me in the way you may be imagining," Augustus said. "She did not betray you to protect herself. She told me the truth because it was the truth, and because she is not the kind of person who can sustain a lie in the direction of someone she has chosen to love." Sebastian blinked. He looked at Nadia. She looked back at him. There was no accusation in her expression. There was something older and sadder and more complicated. The expression of someone who has understood something about the people they love that they had been hoping not to understand. "You used what the physician told us," she said quietly. "You used it deliberately, Sebastian. You chose the exact place that had the least armor." He looked at his hands. "I was afraid. I know, Nadia. I know you were afraid," she said again. "I know what fear does. I have been afraid this entire week." A pause. "But you asked me to destroy a man who was trying to help us." Sebastian went very still. "What?" he said. Augustus spoke then. He spoke for some time. He told Sebastian what the documents contained. The forged papers, the stolen funds, the careful construction of evidence that had been arranged to point at the Hawthorne family, while the actual architects of the scandal remained above suspicion. He told Sebastian that the men behind his father's disgrace had not been political enemies acting on genuine conviction, but men protecting a financial arrangement that required a sacrifice, and that the Hawthornes had been chosen because they were principled and isolated, and had no patron powerful enough to protect them. He told Sebastian about Ambrose. Not everything at once. He gave Sebastian the shape of it first, and then the details, because some truths require a receiving space before they can fully land. Sebastian's face changed as he listened. It went through several configurations. Disbelief. Then the expression of someone fighting. Disbelief, because accepting it requires accepting also that the person they most trusted has been the source of their greatest harm. Then something that was almost grief, and then something harder than grief. "Ambrose told me to run," he said finally, when the accusations began. "He told me that Parliament would not give me a fair hearing, that I needed to disappear, that he was working on a solution. He gave me money. He gave me papers. He arranged it all. He arranged it because a living Sebastian Hawthorne in hiding was less dangerous to him than a Sebastian Hawthorne in front of a parliamentary committee telling the truth," Augustus said. "He needed you running. He needed Nadia focused on eliminating me before the documents I carry could be presented. If both those things succeeded, the evidence disappears. The Hawthorne scandal remains unresolved, and Ambrose continues as before." The room was very quiet. Then Sebastian said, "He used us both." "Yes," Augustus said. "He let our father die disgraced." Augustus held his gaze. "Yes." Sebastian looked at the fire. His expression was the particular blankness of someone whose understanding of the world has just been redrawn. He sat with it, not hurrying it, not trying to manage it. And Nadia watched him and felt the precise pain of seeing someone she loved encounter a truth they could not return from knowing. She had encountered it herself, in pieces, over the past 7 days. She crossed the room and sat beside her brother, and took his hand the way she had when they were children, and the world was frightening. He held on. "What happens now?" he asked. Augustus answered plainly. "I have sent a message to Ambrose requesting his presence this morning. He will come because he believes he still controls the situation, because he has no reason to think otherwise." A pause. "When he arrives, I intend to offer him a choice. Testify truthfully before Parliament regarding his involvement in the original conspiracy, or face the full weight of the evidence already compiled." against him without the possibility of cooperation being noted in his favor. "He will not cooperate," Sebastian said. "He may when he understands the alternative." Augustus looked at him steadily. "Your case, Sebastian, can be argued. Fear and flight are not treason. The false identity is an issue, but it is manageable with the right advocate and the right testimony. If you tell the truth, all of it, including what you know about Ambrose and his arrangements. Your path forward is difficult, but it exists." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. "And the Hawthorne name?" he asked. "Will take time to repair," Augustus said honestly. "I will not pretend otherwise. But time and truth have repaired worse things than a damaged name." He paused. "And what destroyed it was not the Hawthorns themselves. That matters when the full story is known." Sebastian looked at his sister. She looked back at him. She thought about her father, and the slump she remembered. She thought about her mother and the church she had stopped attending. She thought about years of carrying a name that felt like weight rather than inheritance, and about what it might mean to carry it differently. Not lighter, perhaps, but truer. "All right," Sebastian said. He said it quietly, and with the quality of something decided rather than resigned. "I will tell them what I know." Ambrose arrived an hour later. He came into the manor's entrance hall with the particular composure of a man who had already arranged the morning's narrative in his mind. He had the look of someone braced for a problem he believed was manageable. A niece who had perhaps wavered, a mission that had perhaps been delayed, a conversation that would be brief and corrective, and then resolved. He stopped when he saw Augustus waiting. The composure held, but something behind it altered. He looked at Nadia. He looked at Sebastian. He understood, then, that the morning was not proceeding as he had arranged it. "Ambrose," Nadia said. Just that. His name in her voice. Flat and final. Something in his eyes changed. The conversation that followed was not long. Augustus conducted it with the efficiency of a man who had prepared thoroughly and had no interest in drama. He presented the facts of what he knew in order, without unnecessary elaboration. He offered Ambrose the same choice he had described to Sebastian. Ambrose listened. He was a man who could listen with total apparent calm, while inside, a great number of rapid recalculations were being made. When Augustus finished, Ambrose looked at Nadia. "You told him," he said, and in those 3 words was the whole shape of what he had believed about her, that she was a tool, a capable tool, a tool that had failed. "I told him everything," she said, "including what you told me." A silence. Then Ambrose looked away, which was the first honest gesture she had seen from him in years. He cooperated. It took another hour of careful conversation, but he cooperated because the evidence against him was such that cooperation was the only available strategy. And Ambrose was always, fundamentally, a curried strategist, even when the strategy served only himself. He was escorted from Blackwell Manor by 2 of Augustus's people, who would ensure he arrived in London and presented himself, as agreed, to the appropriate parliamentary contacts. Sebastian rode with them. Not precisely as a prisoner, but as a man who had decided to face what needed facing and wanted it over. He held Nadia's hands before he left. "I am sorry," he said, "for the things I said in your room. I know," she said. "I meant them to protect us." "I know that, too." He looked at her, at this version of his sister, standing in the entrance hall of the Duke of Ravenshire's manor in the early morning light with something in her eyes that had not been there before. Something that sat differently in her, more settled. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it. "I think," she said. "I will be." He nodded. The carriage moved down the gravel drive and through the iron gates, and Nadia stood on the front steps and watched it go. And the morning was cool and washed, and clear after the rain, and the grounds of Blackwell Manor spread out in every direction, still and green and very quiet. Augustus came to stand beside her. He did not speak immediately. He was a man who was comfortable with silence, who believed that silence had its own content and did not need to be filled. She appreciated this about him more than she could easily say. "The other guests leave today," he said. "I know." A pause. "You should probably remain." She turned to look at him. His expression was not entirely composed. There were traces of the night still in his face, the weight of what the pre-dawn hours had contained. But beneath the tiredness was something she was beginning to recognize as what he looked like when he had decided something, and was speaking from the decision rather than from strategy. "You told me," he said carefully, "that you loved me more than you feared them." She held his gaze. "I did. I want to be certain," he said, "that you know what that means, not as a confession made in a difficult moment, not as something said in the presence of a broken glass. I want to know if you know what it means in the morning with a clear head, when the crisis is past and what remains is only what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. "It means," she said, "that I came here to destroy you and found I could not. It means that every conversation we had made it harder, and I spent a great deal of time being angry about that. It means that you are a complicated, infuriating, lonely, honest man who looks at people like they are worth seeing, and I find I am not indifferent to any of those qualities." Something in his face softened. "And the air," she said before she could stop herself. Because it was still there, it would always be there a little. The physician's voice, the uncertain ground. She owed him honesty, and so she gave it. "I have told you what the physician said. I do not know what my body is capable of. I want you to know that I am not offering certainty, because I do not have it. I am only offering myself." "Nadia," he said quietly, "I told you in the library, an heir is something I can navigate. A marriage that is empty of everything that makes a marriage worth enduring is something I cannot." She looked at him. "You," he said, "are not empty." She laughed. Briefly, a small unplanned sound that felt entirely unlike anything she had done in this house before today. He almost smiled, the closest thing to a full smile she had yet seen from him. "Stay," he said. "Let the other guests leave. Stay, and we will do the rest of this properly." She thought about the formal machinery by which men of his title and women of her position arranged these things, the weeks and months that properly lay ahead. She thought about all of that. Then she said, "All right." The other guests departed that afternoon. Annabella Carrington left with the particular posture of a woman who had read the morning's developments in the angles of servants' expressions and the quality of the Duke's attention, and who had adjusted her expectations accordingly. She was not malicious. She was simply very good at narrative. Violet Sterling shook Nadia's hand at the door and said, quietly, "Good luck to you," in a way that meant something genuine rather than social. Caroline Prescott said nothing at all, which Nadia had come to understand was Caroline's version of a compliment. By 4 in the afternoon, the gravel drive was empty, and the entrance hall was quiet, and Blackwell Manor exhaled, very slightly, the held breath of a house that had been performing all week, and was now finally itself again. Nadia sat in the library. Augustus came in at 5, carrying 2 cups of tea, which was so entirely unlike the formal machinery of a duke that something warm moved through her chest. He set one in front of her and took the opposite chair, and they drank tea in the golden afternoon light. And outside, the rain-washed grounds caught the late sun in a way that made everything look briefly extraordinary. "I want to tell you about your father," he said. She looked at him. "Not today," he said. "There is more to gather first, and I want to give it to you fully when I do, but I want you to know that it is coming. What he was, what he actually was, before the version of him that other people constructed, is worth knowing." She thought about her father's face, not the diminished version, the earlier one, the man who had read to her on Sunday mornings, and argued with her about history at dinner, and laughed at his own jokes and loved her mother with a constancy so steady it was almost invisible. She had been so long with the diminished version. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He drank his tea. They stayed in the library until the dinner bell rang, and they were not required to say very much to each other, because some things, once decided, do not need to be re-established. They simply are. 3 months later, in the autumn, when the leaves had gone gold and brown along the avenue of oaks leading to Blackwell Manor's front gates, Nadia Hawthorne became Nadia Blackwell, Duchess of Ravenshire, in a ceremony at the Manor's private chapel, attended by people who had chosen to be present rather than people who felt obligated. Sebastian was there. He had appeared before the parliamentary committee in the weeks prior, and the testimony had done what truth, carefully told, sometimes does: cleared a path through the debris of a lie. It had not been easy or fast, and the process was not finished. But Sebastian stood in the chapel in a decent suit with a straighter spine than he had carried into Blackwell Manor in livery, and when Nadia looked at him from the front of the chapel, he gave her a nod that contained more than she could have articulated. She nodded back. Blackwell Manor had changed around her. Not architecturally, not in any way a visitor would see. But the quality of the air in it was different. The way a room feels different when it has been shut for years, and someone finally opens the window. Servants moved differently when she was present, not with greater or lesser formality, but with a specific kind of ease. The ease of people who have concluded that the new Duchess sees them rather than through them. She had asked their names, all of them. She had asked about the conservatory's orchids, and had found herself in conversation with the head gardener for a full hour, which was probably not what a duchess was supposed to do, and which she intended to do again. She had sat in the library for long afternoons, and asked Augustus questions, and received answers that were honest even when they were complicated. And she had given answers of the same quality in return. She had cried once, late at night, about her father, about the man he actually was, which Augustus had finally told her in full, sitting beside her on the library sofa with the full documentation in his hands and the fire burning low. She had cried, and Augustus had not tried to stop the crying or tell her what to feel. He had simply been present, which was all she needed, and more than she had known to ask for. She had grown into the house, and the house, she thought, had grown into her. On a quiet evening in late November, 6 months after the morning of the broken glass, Nadia found Augustus in the library. He was reading, or he had been reading. The book was open in his lap, but his eyes were on the fire, which was his particular kind of rest, looking at something distant and unhurried while the day finished around him. He looked up when she entered, and his face did the thing it did now, the thing she was not certain she would ever entirely get used to, the particular openness of someone who has decided that in the presence of this specific person, there is no need for armor. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "There is something you need to know," she said. He set the book aside immediately. He turned toward her with the full attention he gave to anything he considered important. She saw the question in his face, and she saw something beneath the question that she recognized as the faint shadow of fear, controlled but present. He had been afraid in ways he had not shown her, afraid that love, which he had not had much experience with, was a more complicated terrain than even he could navigate, afraid that he had chosen correctly and might yet lose what he had chosen. She moved into the room and sat beside him on the sofa. "You told me," she said, "that heir or no heir, I was enough." He held her gaze. "I meant it. I know you did," she said. She took his hands, both of them, and held them in hers. "That is why I want you to know that the physician was perhaps more conservative in his assessment than the situation warranted." Augustus went very still. She watched understanding arrive in his face. watched it move through him the way light moves into a room, gradual, and then suddenly everywhere. "Nadia," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "That is what I need you to know." He was a man who commanded rooms and frightened Parliament, and had spent 32 years being the most composed person in any space he occupied. She had watched him manage the aftermath of a foiled mission, the exposure of a conspiracy, a parliamentary deposition, and a public marriage announcement with a family whose name was still being rehabilitated, all without visibly losing his composure. He was not composed now. He was not even close. He moved without his usual deliberateness, without the careful management of distance, and gathered her into his arms in a way that was not controlled, or elegant, or appropriate to the studied authority of the Duke of Ravenshire, and he held her with the particular, trembling tenderness of someone holding the most important thing they have ever been given. She felt his breath against her hair. She felt the steadiness of his chest, and the slight unsteadiness of the hands that held her. She felt the specific weight of this moment, which was not the moment she had planned, when she stepped into a black carriage in the rain, with a silver locket at her throat, and a mission pressed against her heart. This was not the ending she had been sent to arrange, but it was the ending she had chosen, and choice, she had learned, was the only thing that made an ending truly yours. Outside, the grounds of Blackwell Manor lay under the November sky, and the last of the oak leaves moved in the evening wind along the avenue, and the light in the library window was warm and steady against the dark. The iron gates at the bottom of the drive stood open. They had stood open all autumn. There was no longer any reason to keep them closed. Nadia Hawthorne had been sent to Blackwell Manor to save her bloodline by ending a man who had, she was told, spent years ending hers. She had arrived with poison in a locket and a hatred she had been given, rather than grown herself. She had found a man who was feared, and lonely and honest in the specific particular way of people who have been surrounded by dishonesty for so long that truth has become the only thing they trust. She had nearly done what she was sent to do. At the final, suspended second, with the glass rising and the fire dying and the morning pressing at the windows, she had done what her own heart required of her instead. She had betrayed her bloodline. She had saved the only man who had ever looked at her and seen exactly who she was. And in the saving, she had built something her bloodline had never managed to build before. For all its pride and history and carefully maintained appearances, she had built something real. If you made it to the end of Nadia's story, I want to hear from you. Did she make the right choice? Could you have saved the man you were sent to kill? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story kept you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe for more dangerous romances where love and betrayal collide. Share this with someone who loves stories that make them feel everything. Until next time, remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose truth over the lies you were raised to believe. I'll see you in the next one.